Morning, and thank you for joining us for this webinar on navigating COVID-19 response and recovery funding. My name is Andy Winkler. I'm an associate director at BPC and help to lead our work on housing and infrastructure. This is the first event of what we hope to be many more with members of BPC's new task force of former government officials and emergency management experts. We've brought them together to help BPC develop some actionable bipartisan reforms for our nation's disaster response system. Today's event is focused on the suite of funding available for COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, especially those in the CARES Act, how they can be accessed and used effectively, and what additional resources might be needed. 4 of our task force members are joining us today to share their insights and their expertise. First up, we have Jeff Bayard, who is a former FEMA Associate Administrator. He spent years at the Alabama Emergency Management Agency, and he's now at Team Rubicon, a nonprofit that recruits veterans, Jeff included, and first responders to aid in disaster response. We also have Brian Kuhn, who is a former director at the Florida Division of Emergency Management. He now serves as IEM's Vice President of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. We have Stan Gamont, who is a Senior Advisor for Community Recovery with Hagerty, where he started after 32 years of service at HUD, including his role as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs, managing the Community Development Block Grant Program, CDBG, CDBG-DR for disaster recovery, the HOME program, and many others. And then finally, we have Pam Patenaude, who will be helping me moderate today. She was most recently Deputy Secretary of HUD, but she is also BPC's newest board member, so I hope everyone viewing today will give her a virtual round of applause. We are really lucky to have her and all of her tireless work for BPC. If you're joining us today on Zoom, please use the question and answer function at any time to submit a question. I will try to keep an eye on them as we go along, and we'll also reserve the last 20 minutes of the webinar to answer any questions that you have. So please do use that. You can also submit questions via Twitter using hashtag BPC Live or tweet at BPC. Our handle is BPC_bipartisan. So Jeff, I thought maybe I would start with you. Given the National Emergency Declaration announced on March 13th, since then, all territories, tribes, states, and the District of Columbia have been approved for major disaster declarations under the Stafford Act. Can you kind of walk through what this means for FEMA as an agency, but also what it means for those seeking FEMA assistance?
Yeah, first of all, Andy, thanks for allowing me to be on this panel and a part of the BPC's task force. You know, it scares me when I hear the word expert by my name, so I just need to make that disclaimer that you know, these are changing environments. This is a complex disaster, as many of the participants know. So yeah, I mean, this is the first time in FEMA's history that every state territories had not just an emergency declaration, but a major disaster declaration. But as far as the change, really, if you look at it, I think it's important for everybody to understand it's still Stafford Act, right? It's still public assistance. It's still guided by eligibility factors and processes, even though some of those processes have been streamlined, simplified, and relaxed. But as far as the major disaster declaration, what that really brings is to some states, not all states yet, they've made crisis counseling eligible, which is grants and services down to the state level to help with some of the mental health aspects of this. But outside of that, there's no damage, as we know, to permanent infrastructure like in Brian's neck of the woods down, you know, with the hurricanes or natural disasters that we're used to seeing where you have debris on the ground or you have, you know, certain facilities that may be damaged. So what it's really looking at is the emergency protective measures under the Stafford Act. And it's those steps and measures that states and eligible applicants can take to alleviate the threat or alleviate the impacts of COVID-19. So, you know, the major disaster declaration does some things on the more on the internal side for FEMA, where it frees up a larger portion of the disaster relief fund, where the emergency declaration necessarily does not. But and then from an agency with FEMA's perspective, they're great. I'm one of FEMA's largest, cheerleaders and always will be. But on the recovery side, they are very, very, from 2017 on, the disasters haven't stopped in FEMA. So from a, staffing standpoint, this is definitely going to be a tough load, a tough disaster to move forward. So, where I think that they've done a good job, and of course there'll be bumps in the road. Anytime government, which I was a part of for 18 years, does something new, there's going to be bumps in the road. But the simplified procedures where you can, where eligible applicants can apply directly through the grant portal, I think it's going to be great. Streamlined documentation needed for this type of work is not complex. And when I say that, we're not talking about large engineering projects, Andy. We're talking about really documentation of cost and measures that an eligible applicant has taken to alleviate the threat. And so, my advice is it will always be document your actions, document your actions, and document your actions.
So when we're talking about some state and local governments facing up to 40% of their revenue plummeting, given businesses closing, things like that, how do they really know when there's a package like the CARES Act where they should go? And are they interacting with FEMA to help guide them? Do you really need FEMA assistance right now? Do they have the expertise in-house to kind of steer people in the right direction? Who should they go to when they're looking at, a whole suite of different programs that have different eligible activities? Kind of where should they start?
Right. And that's a great question, Andy. And I think that, the pandemic has created and really reinforced the need for what we know in emergency management is a unified command, but you need to bring a collection of experts. There's not one, definitely at the state or really at the federal level, and surely not at the local level. There's not one agency that's going to know exactly all those, all those answers. So I think a good description is the panel that you have, right? Me and Brian are going to bring certain Stafford Act knowledge and state and local emergency management knowledge, where Stan and Pam are going to bring, a different knowledge that they have based on that background from HUD and some of the grant fundings there. So from, what I know is first and foremost, I'm not definitely not probably the smartest on the panel, but I know 100% is better reimbursement than 75%, right? So, right now Stafford reimbursements at 75% to the state and local government, state and local eligible applicants. So there's a 25% cost share, where the majority, if not all, of the other CARES Act is 100%. So, if I'm looking at that, what I would do is definitely make sure that I'm stacking that money in an appropriate manner to get the most resources, most reimbursement that I can. However, there are certain things that Stafford will immediately pay for. I mean, FEMA's already put, I believe, over or near $1 billion on the streets just in those emergency protective measures. That's a lot of money. So, things like operations of your emergency operations center, certain medical measures that are being taken, those are things that, if the CARES funding is not there yet, that Stafford could be there yet. And it's also my understanding that portions of the CARES Act can be used to offset that match. So I think a team approach on this is going to be and will be the best, from a government standpoint, from a local eligible applicant standpoint, because again, one agency is not going to have the knowledge base to put that in action.
Maybe we can bring Brian in here, because one question that I've been thinking about is, as states start to reopen, or even just local governments start to reopen their economies, how does that kind of change both their priorities for the money that they're spending and what they can spend it on? So I know some in the housing advocacy world have been concerned that if stay-at-home orders are lifted at the state level and other directives, they may not be able to go a local government may not be able to get FEMA assistance, even if their unique circumstances are different than the rest of the state. For example, for moving people out of congregate housing settings. What do you see as kind of this, now that we're more than a month past when the CARES Act was passed, how priorities are changing and where they're starting to use those dollars?
Well, thanks, Andy, for having us again. And first, I want to, emphasize what Jeff said. I don't think there is going to be a single point of contact for assisting state and local governments on how to utilize the funding available from the federal government. I have conversations on a daily basis with state and local governments now at this point, and that's the biggest question: is what's the best mix and how to utilize this funding? They've all put together, from what I'm hearing, they're keeping terrific details on what they've spent their money on, which is great, and they're absolutely going to need it. But now they need to understand what's the best mix to maximize the funding and to achieve all the objectives they want to achieve coming out of this. So that's going to be crucial over the next few months, is to really dive in and understand what are the best methodologies to do this. In some cases, it may be paying for, as Jeff said, getting 100% from the CARES money. In other cases, it might be that you use the CARES money for things that are not FEMA eligible, and take advantage of the fact that you're basically getting that at a discount from the federal government in order to pay for some of those things. And there's also local governments need to consider that in some states, the states pay part of the cost share methodology. So they need to take, consider that. So each jurisdiction is going to be going through that process. And hopefully, one of the things that I think that we can help encourage is the sharing of those best practices across the country, so that as governments go through this, they're not all trying to recreate the wheel. They can rely on each other and share those ideas and best practices. In terms of, as we started to enter the recovery, I think it's going to be imperative that FEMA and other organizations provide very clear guidance as to when the dates are that things will be cutting off, when is the end of this period of funding and what becomes ineligible or what becomes eligible at that point. So there is a very clear delineation of that. One of the things that I experienced when I was in the state of Florida was having to see inspector general audits of previous hurricane seasons, and you would have issues regarding exigent circumstances surrounding hurricanes, when you could use emergency contracting procedures, when you could not, et cetera. And there was always a bit of ambiguity in that situation. We can't afford ambiguity in this situation. So we want to make sure that we're very clear with governments when those deadlines are and what processes they need to change so that they can react accordingly. The mechanisms, the dollars are simply too large to have any kind of ambiguity here. And the inspectors general won't have the capacity to go in afterwards and look at this across the board. So as much as possible, FEMA and other organizations providing that kind of guidance will be important. And in terms of what they're spending it on, you're right. You're starting to see a shift from the medical emergency response now into what can we do to facilitate the economic recovery of those communities, and what's the best way, what's going to generate the best return on investment for that community in terms of getting the businesses back up online as quickly as possible, in terms of getting people back to work, getting those economic engines revved up as much as possible. But they also need to be, as Jeff mentioned, paying attention to hurricane season, which starts in 2 weeks, paying attention to the flooding, paying attention to wildfire, and making sure that they have ideas and set-asides to be ready to deal with those as well.
And do you think that many are, Florida's always held out as an example of a very well-prepared state, given how often it is hit by hurricanes, but we see storms increasing in severity and frequency, and that no one is really prepared for. So how can, do you think there has been enough guidance out there already? Are states, when they're so swamped by COVID response, and especially the hit they're taking economically, focused enough on sort of hurricanes and disasters and flooding and things that could happen when there's so much on their plate already?
There has been guidance, and in March, I was nervous about the amount of guidance and the amount of time and effort dedicated towards planning for hurricane season. I've been pleasantly surprised over the last month and several weeks specifically, as I have seen governments ramp up and really start dedicating time and effort towards preparing specifically for hurricane season from my vantage point, but from the other hazards as well. I think it's going to be kind of a do as much as we can ahead of time, because we're going to have to do that, because there's going to be a lot of plans and processes that simply won't work in a COVID environment. But I am confident that the emergency management agencies, Homeland Security agencies, all the different support mechanisms are working and pulling in that same direction. But we still have a long way to go. I think, one of the things I'm eager to do is touch base with Mike Sprayberry from North Carolina and find out how Tropical Storm Arthur went for him. Even though it was just a brush, what did they put in place for that situation that has worked, and what are the things he wished he would have done ahead of time, so that we can start making sure that other states and locals have that kind of information.
And maybe for both Jeff and Brian, whoever wants to answer, I think that some states are well prepared, but what about sort of disadvantaged rural and tribal communities who were way capacity strained before this ever hit? And there's sometimes that disconnect between how they are governed and their state, which we've seen in, North Dakota, and we've seen in other places. So how can they know who is that point of contact they should go to help prepare? You talk about lessons learned from North Carolina. What are the networks that are sort of working right now that they can tap into for some of those experiences, or to know what to do?
Yeah, I'll take, and I'll let Brian chime in as well. So, I think that's a great question, but those communities, just about in every disaster, that's where a lot of the focus is. And it's a lot of it is, just resource constrained communities. So an example, and I put my Team Rubicon hat on, we're doing a lot of medical work out in the Navajo Nation in Arizona. And what we're starting to see is, the number one protective measure of wash your hands. Well, when you have 30 to 40% of the residents don't have running water, that's an issue. So, and that's not going to be solved overnight. On the hurricane prone states, the tribal nations are pretty savvy. And what I mean by that, they understand the Stafford Act, they understand where to go for assistance. A lot of those communities work through the states, and a lot of them go directly to FEMA. From an emergency management standpoint, one of the, positives of our discipline across the board is people are people, and disasters don't they don't care what your alliances are or anything. So, emergency management as a whole is about helping people, Andy. So I think that, states look at that, and I can't speak for every state, but I can speak for all the emergency managers out there that, they look at that as if there's a community or, a human in need during a disaster, they're going to do everything they can to provide, that immediate response to alleviate that suffering. So I think we're all in the same boat on this one, right? Everybody's nervous about, where to evacuate and where not to evacuate. I really think that, especially in Brian's neck of the woods and others, that you have to look at, it's a good opportunity to look at how we've done evacuations in the past. There is absolutely no need to evacuate Floridians to North Dakota, and that's the way we've done it. Get hundreds of miles away, run from the water and hide from the wind. So we got an opportunity to get smart here on how we do evacuations to alleviate a lot of hardships. Anyways, a concern that I would have definitely if I was back at the state level is, we ask citizens to be prepared. We ask citizens to, have an emergency kind of fund for their own self. A lot of those emergency dollars are already spent now at the family level, right? So, what's the impacts, of that? What's a lot of the unknown impacts that we're walking into? But, Brian, I'll let you kind of tag on that if you have more insight or more insight.
Thank you, Jeff. And Andy, the structure and the mechanisms for assisting those communities, those individuals is already in place. I mean, frankly, the primary job of FEMA, state emergency management agencies, local emergency management agencies, is to help those individuals and those communities who aren't able to help themselves. We spend most of our time, most of our effort on those groups. Those groups are going to be bigger this year, and those groups are going to be bigger for probably a couple of years. And so we're going to have to expand the mechanisms to help, as Jeff said, those individuals we've always had individuals who couldn't evacuate, who didn't have the money for a hotel room, who didn't have money for gas, who didn't have money for 3 days worth of supplies. That group is going to be bigger this year, probably into next year. We've always had communities who had who were strapped for resources, strapped for cash, strapped for what they needed to do for emergency management in preparation and response to a hurricane or a flood or a wildfire. The number of communities is going to be bigger this year. And so the next level of government up is going to need to recognize that and put into place a mechanism to help prop those up. And they're going to have to think differently about the mechanisms they use to prop it up, because some of the tools that they have used in the past may not be completely available this year. What the states and locals use the Emergency Management Assistance Compact to assist each other during disasters. This year, it's likely that support is not going to be as readily available, because everybody's going to need to keep their resources closer at home and can't afford to send them elsewhere. Some of the private sector organizations that have been terrific partners in the past may not be as readily available to assist this year. The non-governmental organizations and the charitable organizations may see a decline in donations, may see a decline in volunteerism because of the events. And so we're going to have to figure out other ways to help do that. But the great part, as Jeff mentioned, is new things will emerge. New best practices, new ideas will come to the fore, and we're going to have to quickly recognize those and fold them into the process and adapt quickly. And then again, spread those ideas out to everybody else so they can take advantage of them. So that's what the planners are doing right now across the country, is trying to recognize where those gaps are going to be and finding ways to fill in those gaps. And I really want to make sure that we have the mechanisms in place to help support that vibrant and urgent exchange of ideas and best practices across the regions, across the country.
One last question before we turn it over to Pam and get into some of the HUD side of things. But so a lot of lawmakers are now looking at these state and local government shortfalls and considering, obviously, the House Democrats put out a new proposal for increased spending, $3 trillion more on top of the $2 trillion that was in the CARES Act. One idea also being considered is to go back and change the FEMA 75% reimbursement and bump it up to 100 to provide for more flexible funding. But that's always been sort of a state-federal partnership, right? We've relied on that cost sharing so that states also pull their weight when it comes to emergency management. But is that something that is worth considering now, given sort of the extreme financial strain that states are under? Maybe Brian,
I'll tell you from a state perspective and a local perspective, I think we absolutely need to consider it. Yes, the system is designed to encourage local investment and state investment in disaster preparedness and disaster spending. And we can get back to that. But right now, what we need to do is make sure that we're not putting communities at risk, lives at risk, because local and state officials are making decisions based on cash flow and not based on what's going to save lives and save communities. And so if we can remove that friction, if we can remove that burden, we will ensure that they are making the right decisions based on the urgency of the situation and not based on how many dollars they have in their wallet. The Pew Charitable Trust put out a new study the other day, and I'm clicking over here to make sure I get the name of the study correct. If I can get I've lost my mouse here. It's called How States Pay for Natural Disasters in an Era of Rising Costs. I just put out this last week on May 12th. And one of the interesting things in there, if you read this article, and I highly recommend it, it's about a 30-minute read. It highlights all the funding mechanisms that states have for paying for disasters. And most states have funds. Most states have reserve funds, rainy day funds, et cetera. But if you go through and look at the amount of dollars that are actually in those accounts, they're pretty small. And I would wager that they're even smaller now that they've gone through COVID. So again, it's going to take a little time to refill those coffers and get their heads around how to pay for all of these kinds of things. And anything we can do to at least consider ways to streamline that process, I think is going to be important.
And Andy, I'll be the unpopular vote, right, from Brian. And I say it this way, I've never been necessarily a proponent of 100% disasters. The one that comes to mind that I worked and we all know about is Katrina, which is continuing to get money on the street, so to speak, many, many years afterwards. So I don't disagree with Brian about flexibility at all. I don't think anybody would. You want to have maximum flexibility. What I would say is before there's a rush to, again, put Stafford Act at 100%. I mean, just the numbers, it doesn't, 2 trillion's already passed, another 3 trillion's working through. So let's just say that goes through at $5 trillion, I mean, the Stafford money now is the small, player on the block. We're normally in disasters. Stafford dollars are the major player on the block. So, I think that, I would rather see efforts focused on to make sure that we got, as Brian said earlier, clarity and who can pay for what and what's eligible for what, clarity in what's already been passed through the CARES Act and through, this next one before, there's now a rush to put Stafford at 100%, because you've got to understand, 2 or 3 major hurricanes in the disaster relief fund is back to a situation where it may not be able to fund permanent work after another Andrew or another. So I think that you use, I look at that as our reserve for other disasters are not going to stop just because we're in a pandemic, right? So instead of looking at, well, let's just increase Stafford to 100%, let's put efforts in to see and say, hey, we've got, $2 trillion already out there. Another, just say it comes in at $1.5 trillion. That's tons of money that, if we could put some clarity on where that could go, there may not be a need for necessarily to put Stafford at 100%, because you can use that money to make that match, which in essence is 100%. Now, I know somebody will say, and rightfully so, well, you're taking that away from maybe an economic recovery measure or so forth. But I'm just, the emergency manager in me says, hey, you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. We got to have some reserves there. So I don't disagree with Brian at all about, let's make sure that we have maximum flexibility to our state and local partners. But I needed to kind of be the devil's advocate on that 100% push.
Well, and Brian, I know that you had mentioned previously FEMA's BRIC program. How are people starting to look at the potential for funding coming this fall, I think, to invest some of that money in mitigation? Is that, especially as we start to think about economic recovery efforts, building things is always part of that story. Maybe that is a pot of money that can go to kind of investing in resilience and limiting the impact of this coming season, or is that money coming too late?
I'm not sure if it's going to work for this hurricane season. One of the concerns that I have is that one of the secondary and tertiary effects of all of this is that mitigation projects funded by the traditional mitigation programs will slow or stop in a lot of areas because of the cost share required for that. And so I think as state and local governments start to choose how they're using their money, they may push pause on some of the mitigation projects that they had planned simply because they don't have the cash or they need to use it elsewhere. And I think that's going to have a reverberating effect on disaster costs for years and potentially decades to come. I think, for example, the seawall that you don't build this year or next because you no longer have the funds to match it, you will see the outcome of that in a flood 10 or 20 years from now, and you'll see additional increased response costs and additional recovery costs. So I am concerned that mitigation projects will slow down as a result of COVID. BRIC funding, I think, will help that because that's coming, that's going to be tied to the amount allocated and obligated through the DRF. So that is going to be an opportunity for states and locals. But, we're going to have to really get out there and push the good return on investment that those programs provide and encourage governments to think long-term in allocating those funds and executing those programs, which is going to be a challenge because they're going to be faced with the budget crisis they're experiencing right now. So excited about the opportunity for BRIC funding and other mitigation, but recognizing that it's going to be a challenge to get folks to embrace it and take full advantage of all the opportunities it's going to provide.
Great. Pam, why don't I turn it on over to you to cover some of the stuff on HUD?
Andy, can you hear me?
I can.
Thank you. Andy, it's great to be working with BPC again, and it's really a pleasure to be working with Stan again. Stan and I have a long history of working together on disasters. Stan, the CARES Act included $5 billion in CDBG We had a lot of discussions about whether or not CDBG DR was the right tool. And you certainly convinced me after many discussions that that would probably take too long. Can you talk about CDBG and how it will be used for COVID and how it differs, and also the allocations?
Sure, and thank you and good morning to everyone. So the Community Development Block Grant Program at HUD has long been used by Congress to deliver funding for state and local government to address a wide range of needs in emergency situations. You know, since 2001, over $90 billion has been appropriated to the program for long-term disaster recovery program. If we turn the clock back a bit more than a decade, back in 2008, 2009, CDBG was a vehicle to deliver assistance to state and local governments to address the abandoned and foreclosed housing crisis in 2008, 2009, 2010. So it's a well-known conduit to deliver that money down to the state and local level for them to execute activities that they believe will benefit their communities. In this particular instance, what Congress has done is rather than creating sort of an offshoot as in the form of the Neighborhood Stabilization Program in 2008, or going with the disaster recovery approach, which is, okay, HUD, here is the money, use the basic CDBG framework, but you may alter it in a very significant way to carry out the long-term recovery need. They've placed this really in the framework of the basic CDBG program, and have provided some relief on key issues right in the statute, so that some of these things are self-implementing, would be the terminology to be used, and doesn't really require an extensive process to issue a Federal Register notice that would describe what those flexibilities are. Key among these changes is the effective suspension and removal of the limitation on the ability of state and local government grantees to use these funds for public service activities. In the regular program, year in, year out, grantees are limited to 15% of the funds that may be spent for public service activities. Here, it could be up to 100%. And Congress has offered that relief with respect to regular CDBG funding allocated in FYs 2019 and 2020. So really a fairly significant pot of money here that local governments and state governments can use to deploy for public service activities. So that's really a key here. And where that takes us is one of the things that I'm hearing most often from folks out in the field is the idea of being able to use CDBG funding for rent relief and potentially mortgage relief. So these are things that are generally not seen within the CDBG program, or only on a very limited basis. But given the need out there that is arising to expend those funds on behalf of individuals, to take care of rent, to potentially deal with mortgages, to deal with utility costs, a lot of local governments are beginning to look at how do we do this. And really, again, in the CDBG framework, that doesn't exist. So they're having to kind of create that, or make use of best practices that they may already be aware of through other programs that HUD runs, such as the home program, where there is a tenant-based rental component. So we're hearing a lot of discussion with regard to that use. Also hearing about the use of CDBG to assist small business as we go forward. Again, a lot of different avenues by which small business may be able to obtain assistance going forward, but local governments want to have some certain say in that, and they're looking at CDBG as that assistance to for-profit entities. So that is, again, a key piece of the puzzle at the local level to ensure that businesses are able to be jump-started as the recovery moves forward.
Stan, can you talk about the allocation methodology that was used for the first $5 billion in the CARES Act?
Sure. So Congress said to HUD, take these funds, this $5 billion, and allocate it in 3 tranches. The initial tranche was $2 billion. And HUD allocated that money the first week of April. And the statute, the CARES Act, said allocate that money based on the standard CDBG formula that was used for FY 2020 funding. So that was a relatively easy process for HUD to execute, and literally was done within 10 days after approval of the CARES Act. The second tranche was $1 billion, and HUD allocated that around May 11th. And that tranche was conditioned by Congress to say this money would only be for states and territories, and that there were certain elements that HUD would consider in allocating those monies. It would not be the standard CDBG formula. It would be a combination of COVID-related data points as based on best data available at the time HUD undertook the effort, as well as any other criteria that HUD would wish to include in that formula. So HUD allocated that $1 billion. So now we're at the point where $3 billion of that $5 billion is out there. There is an additional $2 billion to come. HUD is not under a strict timeline to allocate that money. Statute talks about on a rolling basis going forward. And again, speaks in general to the idea of not basic CDBG formula, but some COVID-related data points and other criteria identified by HUD. So they're going to move forward over the next several months. I would like to think, and it would seem to make some sense, that HUD won't hang on to that money for very long, given the back and forth with regard to the provision of additional assistance to the state and local government level. It would seem like a good idea to allocate money already appropriated that's going to go to the state and local level, get that off the books, move it before considering any other assistance along those lines. So to me, it seems to make some sense to move those dollars sooner than later, but HUD has not provided any clear guidance yet exactly when it will proceed in allocating that final $2 billion.
And did Congress include any provisions for HUD to increase staffing levels to be able to manage this increased workload?
So HUD does benefit to a small degree from the CARES Act. Some additional administrative funding was included in the bill for both the Office of Community Planning and Development at HUD and the Office of Public and Indian Housing. So they'll be able to deploy those funds. The real question is, how quickly will they be able to make use of those dollars? And speaking from a lot of experience, it's a slow process if you want to hire up. Even though you have this additional administrative resource, getting people in the door will be a slow process, and there is a true need to get some additional people in the door. Maybe not so much at the headquarters level, but more so out there at the field office level, the folks who have that frontline contact with state and local officials.
Stan, from our previous conversations, you talked about, local communities and states, the uncertainty about what is a COVID-related cost. Do you want to talk about that?
This has been sort of an open topic and remains an open topic. Exactly what is a COVID-related cost? When you look down through the various programmatic descriptions in the CARES Act, it talks about X amount is appropriated for addressing COVID-related costs or coronavirus-related costs. The language is very similar in almost every provision. Not seeing a lot of information coming out as to what is a universal definition of a COVID-related cost. And so I do believe that there are a lot of folks out there who are being very cautious with regard to this. There are a lot of questions being asked, but to this point, I'm not seeing a ton of guidance coming out from agencies as to precisely what is going to be within the bounds of a COVID-related cost at this point. So I think this is one of those areas where, as state and local officials interact with federal agency officials who are tasked with managing these dollars, they need to be asking this particular question of what is going to be an acceptable cost under the program. And frankly, there ought to be a high level of coordination amongst the various agencies to ensure uniformity, and that there isn't a patchwork of definitions out there that really contribute to confusion and ultimately create a problem, as was noted earlier, in dealing with monitoring reviews conducted by these agencies, either by program staff or by inspector general offices.
Stan, I know you're anxious for HUD to get the balance of the first $5 billion out the door, but Congress obviously has already moved forward with the HEROES Act. That included an additional $5 billion in CDBG, CB. What's your advice for the Senate as they begin to formulate the next stimulus bill?
So I think it's going to take some time for the CDBG money to wash through on the first pass. What I would say is that CDBG funding would be valuable as we move down the road. Again, there are a lot of programs are moving at greatly different speeds as far as the rollout of the dollars. Certain programs have had tremendous uptake from the CARES Act. The payroll protection program, hundreds of billions of dollars allocated out the door to businesses already, moving quickly. There was the individual, the payments to individual households in the CARES Act, moved quickly. The coronavirus relief fund, the allocation to state and local governments, moved quickly. So those things have washed through quickly. But as we look at some of these programs that are predicated on known programs, such as the CDBG program, such as the Emergency Solutions Grant program at HUD, other programs at HHS or transportation, where again, there is a known structure, a known process for moving monies through these programs. I think they're moving at a bit of a slower pace, where so much of the effort early on has been focused on these new programs that provide some immediacy. So as we think about CDBG, it's going to move a bit slower because there is some process associated with developing a plan, saying how you're going to use the money, and then executing those programs out there at the local level. Keeping in mind that the initial $5 billion appropriation for CDBG under the CARES Act is, 1.6 billion more than what was appropriated for the program in FY 2020. And then you're going to layer on an additional $5 billion on top. So it's important to know what you're working with. If you have that, you can then plan better. You can design more effective programs. You know what your resources are. You can make commitments. So from my perspective, it makes a lot of sense to have a funding commitment going forward, so the local governments and state governments can plan how to execute over not just a 3 or 6 month period, but maybe over a 12 to 18 month period, because this is going to be a slow recovery in many respects.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to turn it back over to Andy for Q&A from our audience.
Yeah, before we do that, Stan, I had just one more question. On this last tranche of HUD CDBG funding, is the thinking that you hold it until Congress appropriates more money so that you can disperse it, unlike the first tranche that was by the regular formula allocation, to places that are sort of hardest hit or have a second outbreak? Or is it better to just push it out now?
Well, again, from my own perspective, not putting on my HUD hat, if there's this ongoing discussion, debate about additional assistance to state and local government, whether or not it's warranted, it would seem to me that you move the resources you have at this point in time before you engage much further in a discussion about what comes next. So let's deliver what is available and on the table, and then pick up discussion about what additional amounts may be needed and necessary.
Okay. We had one question that came in. Can tax credits be used with CDBG?
So tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, or some other form. I'll assume LIHDC. I mean, it's possible to do projects with CDBG funds, but that's a long tail to do that in order to go through the funding round or the allocation round on the tax credits at the state level on an annual basis, and then get the money deployed and get the project executed. I mean, that's a couple year spend out if you go down that path. Possible, but for any given community, is that the best use of the dollars that they have available? Or would you look at something like HUD's home program, funded on an annual basis, which really does work very tightly, very closely with low-income housing tax credits. There are other tax credit programs out there as well. I believe the New Markets program is still functional, and as well as the things like historic preservation tax credits. All these things can be used in conjunction with CDBG, but you've got to have the right project, and oftentimes the timeline for getting those kind of projects executed can be long.
Mm-hmm. As a reminder to everybody on Zoom, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom if you want to submit a question. We have about 12 more minutes, so we have a little bit of time. We had one other question from Marion McFadden, who is also a member of our task force. She asked, does the BRIC program have a local match requirement? Maybe Brian or Jeff.
And Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, they're still working on publishing all the rules on that, and I think they are actually out in draft form now, but it has always been envisioned that there will be a local match associated with the BRIC program. So yeah, I believe there is going to be a local match. Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, Brian, you're correct. Yeah, all the mitigation, both traditional HMGP and BRIC, will have a cost share match, state and local cost share match, yes.
And your allocation is usually based on previous disaster spending, right? Or is the BRIC program different now given all of the major declarations that exist across the country?
Yeah, it's my understanding, Andy, and again, Brian, it's probably done more, deep dive into that, but it doesn't differentiate, what's the disaster, right? It's expenditures out of the DRF, so it will be based on what is spent out of that previous year for I believe it's 6% of the BRIC. Brian, anything?
Yeah, that's right, Andy. The traditional mitigation programs, HMGP and others, are based on the disaster funds allocated within your state. BRIC programs could be a nationwide competitive program.
Okay. We have another question about, could disaster recovery begin to require disability adaptations in virtually all rebuilt or renovated housing? I think that's probably a question you get a lot. What is a condition to which something can be rebuilt after a disaster and include higher standards?
Andy, that's a good question. So, from the Stafford aspect, there's certain, eligibilities when it comes to, say, disinfecting a facility and so forth. But, there's got to be a cause of the damage in a facility. So, that permanent work under the Stafford, I'm not going to say, you never say never in emergency management, but, the eligibility of under Stafford is going to be very hard to get there because there's no, home damage. There's no damage to facilities. Now, I understand there may be laws passed based on social distancing or whatever that may be, that would create some modifications and so forth, and I think once those laws are enacted or how that works, there may be opportunities there, but I would not look at Stafford as being the number one funding mechanism for those measures.
Okay. We have another question on which a couple of you have highlighted, that sort of issue of who you go to find the right information. The question is kind of, why isn't there a point of contact for all governments to help you find the right funding stream?
Andy, this is Pam. I think that's been addressed, that the programs are very complex, but several organizations have put together excellent resources. The National Housing Conference has a very comprehensive site. HUD and FHFA work together to put together resources. But again, they're addressed from a HUD point of view and perhaps not with the FEMA lens.
Stan, can you talk to about whether there was technical assistance available in CARES Act and other bills, and who is eligible for those programs?
Sure. Within the HUD programs, there's allocations for technical assistance, and they have standing resources for technical assistance. So to the extent state and local governments are looking for help with things like CDBG, CV, or ESG program, that assistance is available on call because they do have a range of providers already on under agreement, and they can carry it out. And I believe there's additional allocations within the acts for these purposes. I think it's you have to almost go program by program to figure out what sort of technical assistance resources might be available for any given program within any given agency. Again, patchwork effect out there with regard to how these things come about. I am familiar, very familiar with how HUD does it, and you can get a lot of help there. I would be, if I were a local official, I'd be inquiring with an agency that's running a program that I have an interest in that funding stream about what help is available. These websites can be helpful. I will say, having done a fair amount of research in the last month or two on these various programs, you do run into a lot of dead ends in some cases, but you got to be dogged in following up on the website contacts, calling folks. Oftentimes, best to start with the most accessible office for any given federal agency out there, in a field office or a regional office. And then work your way up the ladder. But there are an awful lot of resources out there to help you try and navigate these things.
Okay, let me see if we have another submitted question. It looks like the person who asked before about the point of contact clarified, given that this scenario is much different and that FEMA is now interacting with agencies that maybe it didn't as often interact with before. Is that maybe the case?
Andy, this is Jeff. I think from the local government, local eligible applicants, yes, FEMA has opened up their grants portal where applicants can apply directly, to that and other streamlined measures. But, I also think that utilize what, those systems that have been there before. So, if I'm a mayor or a local applicant, my first point of contact is going to be that state granting agency. In most of the cases, it's the state emergency management, either agency, department, whatever it may be called in that state. I would not just change process just because of the amount of dollars that we're talking about, or the type of disaster, the pandemic that we're talking about. So, I think putting, those questions, those pressures on those state agencies that one may deal with, at least from the emergency management side, that a mayor may deal with in a tornado, don't do that different, right? Deal with that same process. It may not be in person. FEMA is not setting up joint field offices like they traditionally do because of obviously some of the health concerns and the distancing concerns, but they do have federal coordinating officers, named in every state, right? So they do have points of contact for every state. They do have 10 regional offices that have tentacles and FEMA integration teams in a lot of our states. So there's footprints out there. It just may be, not your non-traditional sitting across the desk kind of talking about what's what. But I would say, also utilize systems that are already, that we know work, right? Or at least are there. So that would be my recommendation as well.
And with the time that we have left, Stan, I wanted to get to one more thing about that you raised before on duplication of benefits. I know that FEMA dollars are typically used as a last resort and have requirements that you do not duplicate other benefits that exist in other funding streams. Can you talk about whether those kinds of issues have been clarified given the number of streams that exist and the different activities that can be covered by each one?
I'll attempt to. This is a point that is coming up in virtually every phone call I have with folks across the country, is exactly how do we handle this? Again, this is sort of a unique situation where so much money is coming down so many different chutes, and it is, ultimately in many cases is going to interact with the monies that are available from FEMA under the Disaster Recovery Fund, all the public assistance activities that FEMA is going to be running. It is going to be a very difficult thing to sort out. We kind of come back to this definition. It's similar to the definition of what is a COVID-related expense. There really needs to be a lot of certainty provided to state and local officials going forward from the federal funders with regard to how to handle these duplication of benefit issues. FEMA's got a fair amount of information out there, historical information about how it handles duplication of benefit issues. An awful lot of it kind of goes in some respects to individual assistance as opposed to public assistance. And I would ask Jeff to maybe comment on that, but there's going to need to be a further fleshing out here to provide the level of security and certainty that I think a lot of state and local folks are looking for before they put their foot down and actually begin to roll some of these dollars out. Right now, I'm not feeling that information's out there.
Jeff, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just, I'd echo what Stan said on one, we all know it's complexity, but the duplication of benefits, I would say there's certain things that we know FEMA, those costs are eligible and the money can get into local governments and eligible applicants, coffers relatively quick. Outside of that, I would look at that FEMA as being the last resort, as it always has been. And then continuing to, ask those clarifying questions. That's how you're going to get through this. As we all know, this funding is coming in government terms, light speed, right? In tons and tons, and the dollars are staggering. So, continue to push that. Nothing changes, right? It's locally executed. All disasters, regardless of what it is, begins and ends at the local level. So those local officials need to continue to press and continue to push on those clarifying questions.
Thanks, Jeff. One final question from the audience. Does the CARES Act funding flow directly to county beneficiaries from Treasury or from FEMA?
On the FEMA side, FEMA goes through the state as a grantee, but they've streamlined that. So I'm not sure. I'd let Stan answer or somebody else answer on the CARES Act that's outside of Stafford. But and when I say it goes through the state, it generally does hit an eligible applicant, deals directly, but technically by the Stafford Act, the grantee is the state, and then the state turns around and grants those eligible dollars down to the eligible applicant.
Stan, you want to add on?
Sure. So again, as we think about the CARES Act, you have this combination of new programs, new initiatives, PPP, Coronavirus Relief Fund, the municipal liquidity facility that's over at the Fed now, things like that, all brand new. Then you have these mainline programs that have existed for many years, where in essence you're plussing up accounts and providing some additional flexibilities. And in some cases, there are hybrids of the two. So you've got that. You then have this question of, well, even within these programs, who's eligible to get the monies? So it can be states, it can be local government level, it can be business, it can be private individuals. So again, you've got programs, you've got this real web and grid of programs that are going off in different directions and providing assistance in different manners, be it grants, be it loans. So you really have to go on a program by program basis to understand what the requirements are that are going to govern that program. Is it something that existed before, or is it new? Who can get that money? What's the nature of that assistance? These are all things that need to be understood by state and local officials in order to make the best use of the dollars that are in fact on the table.
Great. So we're just over our time, but if anybody has any last thoughts on just some practical advice for local governments looking to navigate these different funding streams. I know, Stan, you had mentioned a while ago, hiring up is one easy sort of task that people should do, given how high unemployment is and all the needs to process reimbursements and document different funding streams. So maybe if there's any sort of practical pieces of advice that you have.
Sure, I'll start with that. Many of the programs funded under the CARES Act have, there are administrative costs that can be covered out of those expenses, and carefully understand what you may do under each one of these programs. Again, they run the gamut. In some cases, a program may give you no administrative money as a state or local administrator. In other cases, under CDBG, for example, unless HUD changes something, a local government's entitled to up to 20% for its administrative cost. So again, you got to kind of dig in here, understand what the parameters of the program are, and then extract from that what you can in order to make sure you have the capacity to run the program efficiently. And so again, got to go on a program by program basis. There's no single overarching administrative approach to these things.
Brian, any final tips?
I think, as much as I encourage governments to keep their foot on the gas for planning for, a natural disaster that occurs during COVID, and as they start to consider a potential second or third wave, and they definitely need to keep their foot on the gas and work on those, I think it probably is useful for them to pause for just a minute as they consider how best utilize all of the funding mechanisms that are out there to make sure they're getting the right mix, taking full advantage of that, getting the maximum return on investment, and see some of those best practices emerge across the country. So keep the foot on the gas, getting ready for future issues, but take a moment to breathe and make sure that you're utilizing this money in the best way possible.
Pam?
I would just add that there are experts out there that can help local communities and states navigate this, and some of them are on the screen right now. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks, Pam. Jeff?
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I would say, build a team. Build a team. They may not have, 100% of the answers, but you'll get 80. Reach out across jurisdictional lines. Find out what's going on, next door, or even state to state. You can do that without physically meeting, but build a team that's looking at the now, the future. Build a team that's looking at economy and disasters. This is only going to get more complex in a major disaster. Now you're really going to start mixing even FEMA dollars and what's what and what's what. Having a team approach, keep your bench healthy because people are already burned out. So, try to get too deep but have a team, rely on each other, and then, you know, don't be afraid to ask, which I've never met a mayor or a governor that's been afraid to ask anything. So that's what I'd say, build a team.
Thank you, Jeff. So thank you, Brian, Stan, Pam, Jeff. I really am appreciative of your expertise and your insights, and really excited to work with you on our task force. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. I know it's difficult to take the time out of the day, and a lot of people have Zoom fatigue. So we greatly appreciate it. And if you have questions that went unanswered, please reach out to BPC. We want to be as helpful as we possibly can through this time. So thank you all, and look forward to our next events.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Pam.